Hey everyone, Ryan Young, Kama Jiu-Jitsu, and I wanted to cover a controversial topic today. This topic is Carlos Sr., founder of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, versus his brother, Helio Gracie. Now, why all the big deal about Carlos Sr. versus Helio? Really what it comes down to are their descendants, their sons and their grandsons. As time has gone on, what you've seen is a split in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. They all call themselves Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, but one side kind of contends they are the real Jiu-Jitsu. The other side contends they are also the real Jiu-Jitsu, but just with a little different bent. So now these are not necessarily the views of these particular individuals, and I'll explain to you why later on. But it's really the views of their descendants, sons and grandsons, and in some cases great-grandchildren. Because the art has changed and it's not changed. You just kind of go with me on this. So on this side, the art has changed. And on this side, it has not changed. On this side, we're very traditional. On this side, we're very sport-oriented. So what's the difference? Well, traditional generally means self-defense. Sport does not. Now, does that mean that family members who push the sport side don't do any self-defense? No, that's not true. Some of them do. A lot of them don't, but some of them do. So it's here that you really have the big differences, because you now have what is becoming called GJJ and BJJ. All right, sport versus traditional. And we've covered this before, as have many people ad nauseum, and it's going to continue on. I'm not the first, and I definitely won't be the last to play this out here. There aren't that many people that would actually put in those terms, or brother against brother. Because if you look at Helio's sons, who do we have here? Orion, Helson, Hickson, Boyce, Holker, Hoyler. Those are the main ones. I think there's one more son, Robin. Self-defense, 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 self-defense. Hoyler and Holker, they probably straddle the line in that they do both self-defense as well as competition. And I think a lot of it just kind of has to do with the fact that they're in Brazil. They still run the old Gracie Umaita Academy. In Brazil, it's very competitive, or at least it was back in the day when you had Gracie Umaita versus Carlson Gracie versus Alliance versus Gracie Baja. Those are the four main teams. Now you've got a ton of different teams, but those are the four main teams that would compete. And they competed on the sport level. And once the CBJJ merged with the IBJJF, which was Gracie Baja, then the sport side really started to kick in. And that's where we're here. So the main son of Carlos Sr., who is the biggest promoter of the sports side of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, is his son, Carlos Jr., who owns the IBJJF as well as Gracie Baja. Just by the fact that Gracie Baja has so many academies all over the world, probably more than all the others combined, it just makes it that they're really literally in every city, sometimes more than one in the city. And their whole thing is to grow jiu-jitsu through competition. The reason why this is grouped under Carlos Sr. is because Carlos Sr. felt that his family art should be spread through sport. Helio went along with it, and I think he was one of the very first heads of the sport sanctioning body. As a result, a lot of Carlos's sons, they not only were big on the sports side, they were also very tuned in and piped into the IBJJF, which means that they observe all their rules, including the belt ranks, right? When the kids ranks were originally done, it was white, yellow, orange, green. And then from there, they went into the adult ranks, which is blue, purple, brown, black. Now they have a multitude of colors and combination colors. I couldn't even begin to tell you what the belts are these days. All I know is I think I had counted about 10 different belts and about 3 or 4 grades of each belt, which meant that you had promotions going, every month or two, which is very different from what the traditional was. I mean, you might be lucky to get a degree on your white belt in 6 months, sometimes even longer, of Helio's side of family. Whereas on this side, they're non-competitive. Okay? The competition is just not a thing for them because it's all about self-defense. A lot of the things that are practiced in a self-defense school, you don't really do in a sports school. Why? Because of the rules. Okay. There are all these rules. There basically is a rule book for the IBJJF that has permitted and not permitted techniques. As an example, a can opener, which is basically a form of a neck crank, is not permitted. Slams are not permitted. We've talked about that before as far as slams. You can't slam people who are playing guard. You can't slam people who are playing triangle, who are doing a triangle on you. If they armbar you, you can't pick them up and slam them. And a win is not only a win by points and submission, there also are advantages, and if there are no points and no advantages in a match, then the referee can decide who's going to win. With the sports side, there has to be a winner, as simple as that. If you like, I think Professor Dave had mentioned in a previous video, contrasting judo and jiu-jitsu, how with judo you're looking for, for the ippon, which is the full point, which is the ultimate win. When you throw a beautiful throw and you just land them on their back, boom, done, you get the ippon. Versus winning half points and quarter points, the wazari and the koka. Get somebody a sloppy throw, maybe your ref gives you a wazari and then you pin them and you hold them for 20 seconds. That's your other half, and then you get your full point that way. So with jiu-jitsu, it's a submission, right? If you don't get the submission, then you get points. If you don't win by points, then advantages. If not advantages, then by referee's decision. So on the, on the side of Helio, it's all about the submission, right? If you look at Gracie and his competition record, he never cared about points. He's got the most come from behind victories of anybody in competition history, if I'm not mistaken. What is it, like 60? I could be wrong, could be 80. And also when he was a brown belt, he held a record of some sort, winning, 60, 70 matches, maybe even 80 in a row by submission, which is, prior to that was unheard of. But that's really all he went for. He adapted jiu-jitsu of his father, Rickson Gracie, to work in competition. Whereas a lot of the competition schools today, they eliminate a lot of the techniques here and they go very deep into the competitive techniques. So why pit Carlos Sr. against Helio? Only because, for instance, with our line, we come down from Rickson, right? And Rickson is all about self-defense. In fact, he formed the JJGF, which is his federation, with the hopes of combining the sports side with the traditional side and creating a uniform standards sanctioning body. Whereas the IBJJF doesn't have any type of self-defense requirements for any of their schools. It's basically the sports. Carlos did like the spread of his family art through sport, whereas Helio always said it was a traditional self-defense martial art. The only reason why we do Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is for self-defense. And for everybody who comes down from Helio's side of the family, generally, not all the time, but generally, that's the belief. There are people that whose lineage trace back to Helio that feel differently. Now, let's go to another thing. You hear a lot of Carlos's sons. In particular, I've heard people like Carlson Sr. I've heard Carle, both Carlos is among his senior sons. I think you had Carlson, you had Hobson, you had Hayson, you had Heusen, and I think somewhere down the road is Carle. Now, one thing that a lot of his sons, especially his older sons, will do is they'll say, no, I was trained by my father, not by Helio. Carlson is famous for that. Carle, also, same thing. like they say, well, no, I wasn't trained by my uncle, I was trained by my father. For somebody like me, who's way, way, way down the line in learning this, it doesn't make a difference to me. They're all Gracies, you know, and they all have their place in history with the art that I love. So I can look at this from a different perspective, at least I think so, in that I don't really have a bone to pick with anyone. But just based on what they say, you know, these two especially, they say they were taught by their father. However, Hasten, who was the third oldest, said they were all taught by Uncle Helio. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? You know, there is a big age difference between Helio and Carlson, maybe 30 years or so. Helio was training, he was fighting, he was teaching. Am I to believe that Carlson and the much younger Carle wasn't taught by Helio, but Hasten was? Especially when he says that Uncle Helio taught everybody? I wasn't there, but based on an outsider's point of view, I would have to conclude that Helio basically taught everybody. I know Carlos taught Helio. Why would I think the way I think? Well, if you've read Carlos's daughter's book, I think her name is Hayla, R-E-Y-L-A. She wrote a good book on the whole family. And one thing she did point out was that once Helio was at that point in life where he was running the academy and he was teaching students, Carlos kind of stepped back. He stepped back from the academy. He was concentrating on formulating the diet. He also kind of stepped back and continued to formulate the vision on how he wanted Helio to run things for him. Because if you really think about it, Helio really admired his brother, as did a lot of the family members, especially Carlos's sons and grandsons. He was the one that held the family together. Once he died, I don't want to say the family fell apart, but they started to more so go their own separate ways. There was less of a unified front in the family once Carlos Sr. was done. If you think of it, Carlos Sr. was the CEO, and Helio was the chief operating officer of the family. So he had Carlos Sr. had the vision, and Helio was the one who implemented. So he decided what he wanted Helio to do. Helio just said yes, sir, and he went and did it. And he did it to a T. He lived by his brother's diet. He taught what his brother told him to teach. He eventually, you know, had a mind of his own in that he didn't change. I mean, when Carlos was kind of making the change to spread the art via sport and competition, Helio was kind of into it, but to him, it was still a traditional self-defense art. And he held that view to his day, and his consistency on that shows up with his sons. All his sons, they all say Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is not a sport, it's a self-defense art. Every single one of them. That's where Helio had a great influence. I think what a lot of the problem is with people on Carlos's side of the family was that Helio he's a no-nonsense guy. No nonsense meaning he's kind of a hard ass. I mean, you just hear about the way he talks, about how he talks about his sons are invincible, and he is supremely confident in the art. By actually talking like that too, he does exhibit favoritism, which I guess would then end up creating some sort of resentment on Carlos's son's side. And in fact, there was the story about Halls, who was unique in that he was on both sides of the family. Well, how could that be? Well, biologically, he was a son of Carlos, but Helio adopted him and raised him as his son. You can look at his first son, his oldest son, Helio's oldest son, was Halls. Right? Now, Halls, went back and forth between both sides because a lot of the time both sides of the family spent it together, right? But Helio raised Halls, and part of it, and this is what I was told by a family member on Carlos's side, is because Halls was illegitimate. Carlos's wife at the time did not want a love child of Carlos's in her house. So Helio said, no, I'll take him, let me raise him, because he had no children at the time because his wife was not able to have children. So he took on Halls. And then shortly after that, Horian was born. right? And in Hayla Gracie's book, she mentions that Halls was as good as he was because he was always trying to vie for Helio's attention and affection. Because once Rorion was born, then a lot of Helio's attention went to Halls. His attention, his dreams, his desires went from Halls to Rorion, because Rorion was his flesh and blood, direct flesh and blood rather than nephew. That might have been the source of a lot of the animosity between Carlos's sons and Helio's sons, because Helio showed, from what seems to be some pretty natural and obvious favoritism. You know, I guess there's a situation that happened that I heard about from a black belt who is a student under a Gracie family member, and it had to do with Jean-Jacques and Royler. So obviously Royler and Jean-Jacques is a nephew of Carlos, and for whatever reason, Carlos and Helio would make bets or debate, you know, who's got the better descendant. I think there was one where Royler and Jean-Jacques, who were of similar age, were put together in a match by both Helio and Carlos. Jean-Jacques came out ahead, from what I understood. But you know, the fact that, you know, they would Helio would pit them against each other really, you know, doesn't make much sense, because I try not to show favoritism toward anybody. I give everybody, all my students, equal affection, and I, you know, even when my kids are in the class. In fact, with my kids, I almost definitely do not praise them in class when other kids are training with them, and my kids know it. It's kind of a thing that we have between us, where I'm very proud of my kids, but at the same time, I'm not going to outwardly show favoritism toward my kids at the expense of somebody else. And I think this might have been one of those situations that kind of cemented some of the animosity that goes from Carlos's sons toward the family on this side. So I think that's where some of the Carlos versus Helio comes into being. But, you know, like I mentioned earlier, they were both very important to the family arc, because if not for Helio, there would be no Rorion, there would be no Rickson. Rorion was basically the pioneer to bring Jiu-Jitsu to the US and then to the rest of the world. Carle Gracie was already in the US by the time Rorion got here, but Carle didn't have big dreams for the art. I'm sure he probably ran a little school, he probably taught some students, but like I said, he didn't have the Gracie Academy in mind. He didn't have something like the Ultimate Fighting Championship in mind. That's where, you know, we needed both of them. So if I have to choose between one or the other, I'm not gonna, because it's like choosing between an apple and an orange when you want to eat grapes. It's not a choice, it's a false choice. So for all of us who like to think in these terms, have at it. You know, it's fun to kind of think, you know, who is more important. But at the end of the day, they're both equally important, but in a different way, right? Carlos is the founder. Helio was the implementer. You know, Carlos was a visionary, but Helio was a hard ass. He instilled a lot of discipline, and he was not afraid to be the bad guy. Not that Carlos was necessarily afraid to be the bad guy, he just wasn't that type of guy. I can pretty much tell you from my experience that whoever is a hard ass who instills discipline in his students will have the students that, in my mind, are better. You have to have a huge level of discipline to be proficient in Jiu-Jitsu. Come down to today, now we have basically two different types of Jiu-Jitsu. Hopefully at some point in time, somebody will bring it all back together. I don't know who that's going to be. I don't know when that's going to be. I hope it happens. I don't want it to be like what happened with Judo versus Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, where they started off as one art and they became two distinct separate arts. But things evolve, not always for the better, but they do evolve. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for liking or disliking. Thanks for sharing, right? Be sure to share this with people if you think it's useful. And be sure to subscribe to our channel. And until next time, happy training. it.